Kristin, I wonder if we could dive into prejudice mindsets. What are they? Why did how did you come to study them?
Yes. So this idea of prejudice mindsets came from looking and diving into some of the literature on kids and how kids start to develop biases. And when we look at most of the research, you can see that by and large, not all of it, but a large portion of it really focuses on understanding kids' racial prejudice, if we're talking about race, for example. And so we ask questions like, when do kids form prejudice? What leads to prejudice? Really focusing on prejudice as an attitude, this internal thing that kids have that they develop. If you dig down, a smaller portion of the research focuses on kids' behavior. What do kids do in race-related situations? When might they discriminate? When might they not? When do they choose to have a friend of a different race? When do they choose to exclude someone who might look different than them on any number of dimensions? And less of the work focuses on that. I think in part, arguably, because we assume that prejudice is what leads to this biased behavior, right? We see this, we assume there's this direct connection. So if we can understand prejudice and deal with that, we're good. We are tackling the problem. And so really have focused so much of our effort on that. And actually, if you look at some of what we know, even not just looking at prejudice and behavior discrimination, but even looking at just attitudes and behavior, the connection between the two, it's not such a clear connection. And so, yes, we can understand a lot about prejudice, but it may not help us understand how to create better interactions, how to create more cross-group friendships. There's this like kind of a disconnect there. And interestingly, if we look at when kids start to, whether they, even if they had cross-race friends earlier in their childhood, when they start to have less of them, it happens at a time where prejudice isn't changing all that much. In fact, what we know from the research is it's actually not increasing at that time. It may even be decreasing according to some or staying stable. And so there seems to be not this connection between the two. So then we started to think about, well, what are things that might explain behavior a little bit better? And so that's when we started to think about prejudice mindsets. And so what that means is when you think about prejudice, do you think about prejudice as something that can change, it's malleable, or do you think about it as something that's fixed, that someone has, it's inside of them, it's always going to be the same? And basically, what we found in our research is that this difference in how you think about prejudice is what matters. In terms of children's motivations to want to maintain cross-group friendships or interact with someone who is a different race than them. And so this research was originally conducted with 8 to 13-year-old children. And we found that the more they thought about prejudice as fixed, the less likely they wanted to interact with a cross-group individual, a peer, the more anxious they were when they were put in those interactions, and the less likely they really wanted to do it again. Versus if they thought about it as valuable, we saw kind of the opposite, right? They're more likely to want to continue to have those interactions. I think an important aspect is, well, do we know that it's the mindsets, or could it be maybe people who are more fixed also are more prejudiced too? So we do also measure prejudice and look to see how, does that matter? And basically what we found was that even when we measure prejudice, the mindset seemed to be more important. So someone who doesn't show very much prejudice in terms of their level of prejudice as we measure it, they actually could show look like they're really biased in terms of their behavior. Well, they'll avoid the interaction, they'll have a bad interaction, they'll say, I don't want to interact with cross-group friends, but I'm fine interacting with someone who's the same group as me. So all of that looks like prejudice when we think about how that is enacted in behavior, but yet this kid has a low level of prejudice. When we look at attitudinal prejudice, what we find is that that same kid thought about prejudice as fixed. And so something about thinking about it as fixed makes us really more worried about the implications of how that interaction is going to go. That's a possibility that I might discriminate or I might be discriminated against. And so thus, I want to not go there. I don't want to have that interaction. And so it seems to matter quite a bit.